Well, I see myself. Hello, I'm back. So, it is again time for the break. I decided to leave a bookmark where I end, so I can physically see how much I have left. But, yeah, let's just, no chit chat, let's get straight to it, because, yeah, you know my thoughts on this book. Okay, so we are, fuck me, I forgot Roman numerals 6. Yeah, should be chapter 6. My lady's tongue is ooh, right off the bat, I'm not doing this correctly. Whee! My lady's tongue is like the metal blades that cut you stroking them with idle hands. Nice cutting is her function. She divides, with spiritual edge, the millet seed, and makes intangible savings. As Mr. Casaubon's carriage was passing out of the gateway, it arrested the entrance of a pony phaeton? Carriage. I give up. Driven by a lady with a servant seated behind. It was doubtful whether the recognition had been mutual, for Mr. Casaubon was looking absently before him, but the lady was quick-eyed, and threw a nod and a how do you do in the nick of time. In spite of her shabby bonnet and very old Indian shawl, it was plain that the lodge-keeper regarded her as an important personage, from the low curtsy which was dropped on the entrance of the small phaeton. Well, Miss Fitchett, how are your fowls laying now? Said the high-coloured, dark-eyed lady with the clearest chiselled utterance. Pretty well for laying, madam, but they've taken to eating their eggs. I've no peace of mind with them at all. Oh, the cannibals! Better sell them cheap at once. What will you sell them, a couple? One can't eat fowls of a bad character at... Slow down. Oh, the cannibals! Better sell them cheap at once. What will you sell them, a couple? One can't eat fowls of a bad character at a high price. Well, madam, 1/2 crown. I couldn't let 'em go, not under. 1/2 crown these times? Come now, for the rector's chicken broth on a Sunday. He has consumed all hours that I can spare. You are half paid with the sermon, Mrs. Fitchett. Remember that. Take a pair of these tumbler pigeons for them. Little beauties, you must come and see them. You have no tumblers among your pigeons. Well, Madam, Master Fitchett shall go and see him after work. He's very hot on new sorts, to oblige you. Oblige me? That will be the best bargain he ever made. A pair of church pigeons for a couple of wicked Spanish fowls that eat their own eggs. Don't you and Fitchett boast too much, that is all. The phaeton was driven onward with the last words, leaving Mrs. Fitchett laughing and shaking her head slowly with an interjectional surely, from which it might have been inferred that she would have found the countryside somewhat duller if the rector's lady had been less free-spoken and less of a skinflint. Indeed, both farmers and labourers in the parishes of Freshitt and Tipton would have felt a sad lack of conversation but for the stories about what Mrs. Cadwallader said and did. A lady of immeasurably high birth, descended, as it were, from unknown earls, dim as the crowd of heroic shades, who pleaded poverty, pared down prices, and cut jokes with the most companionable manner, though with a turn of tongue that let you know who she was. Such a lady gave a neighborliness to both rank and religion, and mitigated the bitterness of uncommuted tithe. A much more exemplary character, with an infusion of sour dignity, would not have furthered their comprehension of the 39 Articles, and would have been less socially uniting. Mr. Brooke, seeing Mrs. Cadwallader's merit from a different point of view, winced a little when her name was announced in the library where he was sitting alone. "I see you have had our lower Cicero here," she said, seating herself comfortably, throwing back her wraps and showing a thin but well-built figure. "I suspect you and he are brewing some bad politics, else you would not be seeing so much of the lively man. I shall inform against you. Remember, you are both suspicious characters since you took Peel's side about the Catholic bill. I shall tell everybody that you are going to put up for Middlemarch on the Whig side when old Pinkerton resigns, and that Casaubon is going to help you in an underhand manner, going to bribe the voters with pamphlets and throw open the public houses to distribute them. Come, confess!" "Nothing of the sort," said Mr. Brooke, smiling and rubbing his eyeglasses, but really blushing a little at the impeachment. "Casaubon and I don't talk politics much. He doesn't care much about the philanthropic side of things, punishments and that kind of thing. He only cares about church questions. That is not my line of action, you know." "Rather too much, my friend. I have heard of your doings. Who was it that sold his bit of land to the Papist at Middlemarch? I believe you bought it on purpose. You are a perfect Guy Fawkes. See if you are not burned in effigy this 5th of November coming. Humphrey would not come to quarrel with you about it. So I am came. And we have our first name. And that is our first age, too. Very good. I was prepared to be persecuted for not persecuting. Hold on. I was prepared to be persecuted for not persecuting. Not persecuting, you know. There you go. That piece of claptrap you have got ready for the hustings. Now do not let them lure you into the hustings, my dear Mr. Brooke. A man always makes a fool of himself, speechifying. There's no excuse for being on the right side, so that you can ask a blessing on all your hummings and hawings. You will lose yourself, I forewarn you. You will make a Saturday pie of all parties' opinions, and then be pelted by everybody." "That is what I expect, you know," said Mr. Brooke, not wishing to betray how little he enjoyed this prophetic sketch. "What I expect as an independent man. As to the Whigs, a man who goes with the thinkers is not likely to be hooked on by any party. He may go up with them to a certain point. Up to a certain point, you know. But that is where you ladies never understand. Where your certain point is. No, I should like to be told how a man can have any certain point, when he belongs to no party, leading a roving life and never letting his friends know his address. Nobody knows where Brooke will be. There's no counting on Brooke. That is what people say of you, to be quite frank. Now, do turn respectable. How will you like going to sessions with everybody looking shy on you, and you have with a bad conscience and an empty pocket? I don't pretend to argue with a lady on politics, said Mr. Brooke with an air of smiling indifference, but feeling rather unpleasantly conscious that this attack of Mrs. Cadwallader's had opened a defensive campaign to which certain rash steps had exposed him. Your sex are not thinkers, you know. Verum et mutable semper. That kind of thing. You don't know Virgil. I knew. Mr. Brooke reflected in time that he had not had the personal acquaintance of the Augustan poets. I was going to say poor Stoddart, you know. That was what he said. You ladies are always against an independent attitude. A man's caring for nothing but truth and that sort of thing. There is no part of the country where opinion is narrower than it is here. I don't mean to throw stones, you know, but somebody is wanted to take the independent line, and if I don't take it, who will? Who? Why, any upstart who's got neither blood nor position. People of standing should consume the independent nonsense at home, not hawk it about. And you? Who are you going to marry your niece, as good as your daughters, to one of our best men? Sir James would be cruelly annoyed, and it would be too hard on him if you turn around now and make yourself a Whig signboard. Mr. Brooke again winced inwardly, for Dorothea's engagement had no sooner been decided than he had thought of Mrs. Cadwallader's prosperous taunts. It might have been easy for an ignorant observer to say, quarrel with Mrs. Cadwallader, but where is the country gentleman who goes and quarrels with his oldest neighbor? Who could taste the fine flavor in the name of Brooke if it was delivered casually, like wine without a seal? Certainly a man can only be cosmopolitan, up to a point. I hope Chatham and I shall always be good friends, but I am sorry to say there is no prospect of him marrying my niece, said Mr. Brooke, much relieved to see through the window that Celia was coming in. Why not? Said Mrs. Cadwallader with a sharp note of surprise. It is hardly a fortnight since you and I were talking about it. My niece has chosen another suitor. Has chosen him, you know. I had nothing to do with it. I should have preferred Chatham, and I should have said Chatham was the man any girl would have chosen. But there's no accounting for this thing. Your sex is capricious, you know. Why, whom do you mean to say that you are going to let her marry? Mrs. Cadwallader's mind was rapidly surveying the possibilities of choice for Dorothea. But here Celia entered, blooming from a walk in the garden, and was greeted with, and the greeting with her delivered Mr. Brooke from the Bleh. Okay, if I'm doing that. How do professionals do this? But here Celia entered, blooming from a walk in the garden, and the greeting with her delivered Mr. Brooke from the necessity of answering immediately. He got up hastily and saying, "By the way, I must speak to Wright about the horses," shuffled quickly out of the room. I hope that's a first name, but either way, That is a W. I should probably put Mr. Book down. I already did. Oh well. My dear child, what is this? This about your sister's engagement? Said Mrs. Cadwallader. She is engaged to marry Mr. Casaubon, said Celia, resorting, as usual, to the simplest statement of fact, and enjoying this opportunity to speak to the rector's wife alone. This is frightful! How long has it been going on? I only knew of it yesterday. They are to be married in 6 weeks. Well, my dear, I wish you joy in your brother-in-law. I am so sorry for Dorothea. Sorry? It is her doing, I suppose. Yes, she says Mr. Casaubon has a great soul. With all my heart! Oh, Mrs. Casaubon, Why do we have characters with the same... Chetham, Casaubon, now Cadwallader. Yay! Oh, Mrs. Cadwallader, I don't think it can be nice to marry a man with a great soul. Well, my dear, take warning. You know the look of one now. When the next one comes and wants to marry you, don't accept him. I'm sure I never should. No, one such in a family is enough. So your sister never cared about Sir James Chetham. What would you have said to him for a brother-in-law? I should have liked that very much. I am sure he would have been a good husband. Only, Celia added with a slight blush. She sometimes seemed to blush as she breathed. I don't think he would have suited Dorothea. Not high-flown enough? Dodo is very strict. She thinks so much about everything and is so particular in what one says. Sir James never seemed to please her. She must have encouraged him, I'm sure. That is not very creditable. Please don't be angry with Dodo. She does not see things. She thought so much about the cottages, and she was rude to Sir James sometimes, but he is so kind, he never noticed it. Well, said Miss Cadwallader, putting on her shawl and rising as if in haste, I must go straight to Sir Chetham and break this to him. He will have brought his mother back. He will have brought his mother back by this time, and I must call. Your uncle will never tell him. We are all disappointed, my dear. Young people should think of their families in marrying. I set a bad example, married a poor clergyman, and made myself a pity. I set a bad example, married a poor clergyman, and made myself a pitiable object among the de Bracy's. Obliged to get my coals by a stratagem, and pray to heaven for my salad oil. However, Casaubon has money enough. I must do him that justice. As to his blood, I suppose the family quarterings are 3. Okay, this is a phrase I have never heard, and I don't know if I want to look it up just yet. Okay, as to his blood, I suppose the family quarterings are 3 cuttlefish sable and a commentator rampant. I suppose the family quarterings are 3 cuttlefish sable and a commenter rampant. I guess horse? Oh. I, yeah, I know, because sable is usually referred to a coat pattern. Or, like a sable coat. But, cuttlefish, sable, and a commenter rampant. Also, hello. By the by, before I go, my dear, you must speak to your Mrs. Carter about pastry. I want to send my young cook to learn of her. Poor people with 4 children like us, can't afford to keep a good cook. I have no doubt Miss Carter will oblige me. Sir James's cook is a perfect dragon. In less than an hour, Mrs. Cadwallader had circumvented Mrs. Carter and driven to Feshett Hall, which was not far from her own parsonage, her husband being resident in Feshett and keeping a curate in Tipton. Sir James Chatham had returned from the short journey in which had kept him absent for a couple of days, and had changed his dress, intending to ride over to Tipton Grange. His horse was standing at the door when Mrs. Cadwallader drove up, and he immediately appeared there himself, whip in hand. Lady Chatham had not yet returned, but Mrs. Cadwallader's errand could not be dispatched in the presence of grooms, so she asked to be taken into the conservatory close by, to look at the new plants, and on coming to a contemplative stand, she said, "I have a great shock for you. I hope you are not so far gone in love as you pretend to be." It was no use protesting against Mrs. Cadwallader's way of putting things, but Sir James's countenance changed a little. He felt a vague alarm. "I do believe Brooke is going to expose himself after all. I accused him of meaning to stand for Middlemarch on the Liberal side, and he looked silly and never denied it. Talked about the independent line and the usual nonsense." "Is that all?" said Sir James, much relieved. "Why," rejoined Mrs. Cadwallader with a sharp note, "you don't mean to say that you would like him to turn public man in that way, making a sort of political cheap jack of himself?" Okay. Cheap jack is a hawker or street peddler. "He might be dissuaded. I should think he would not like the expense." "That is what I told him. He is vulnerable to reason there. Always a few grains of common sense and an ounce of miserliness. Miserliness is a capital quality to run in families. It is the safe side for madness to dip in." "Oh, okay, like, oh, what was his name from the Christmas Carol? The old miser. Yeah, that's it. Being a miser is a good madness." Okay, then. "And there must be a little crack in the Brooke family, else we should not see what we are to see." "What? Brooke standing for Middlemarch?" "Worse than that. I really feel a little responsible. I always told you Miss Brooke would be such a fine match. I knew there was a great deal of nonsense in her. A flighty sort of methodistical stuff. But these things wear out of girls. However, I am taken by surprise for once." "What do you mean, Mrs. Cadwallader?" said Sir James, his fear lest Miss Brooke should have run away to join the Moravian Brethren, or some preposterous sect unknown to good society, was a little allayed by the knowledge that Mrs. Cadwallader's always made the worst of things. What has happened to Miss Brooke? Pray speak out. Very well. She is engaged to be married. Mrs. Cadwallader paused a few moments, observing the deeply hurt expression in her friend's face, which he was trying to conceal by a nervous smile while he whipped his boot. But she soon added, engaged to Casaubon. Sir James let his whip fall and stooped to pick it up. Perhaps his face had never before gathered to such a concentrated disgust as when he turned to Mrs. Cadwallader and repeated, Casaubon? Even so, you know my errand now. Good God, how horrible! He's no better than a mummy. The point of view has to be allowed for, as that of a blooming and disappointed rival. She says he is a great soul, a great bladder for dried peas to rattle in, said Mrs. Cadwallader. What business has an old bachelor like that to marry, said Sir James. He has one foot in the grave. He means to draw it out again, I suppose. Brooke ought not... I'll give this book one thing. I kind of do like these insults. He's no better than a mummy. He's got one foot in the grave. He means to draw that out again. Okay, I admit that is funny. Brooke ought not to allow it. He should insist on being put off till she is of age. She would think better of it then. What is a guardian for? As if you could ever squeeze a resolution out of Brooke. Cadwallader might talk to him. Not he. Humphrey finds everybody charming. I never can get him to abuse Casaubon. He will even speak well of the bishop, though I tell him it is unnatural in a benefied clergyman. What can one do with a husband who attends so little to the decencies? I hide it well as I can by abusing everybody myself. Come, cheer up. You are well rid of Mrs. Brooke, a girl who would never have been requiring you to see. Come, cheer up. You are well rid of Mrs. Brooke, a girl who would have been requiring you to see the stars by daylight. Between ourselves, little Celia is worth two of her, and likely, after all, to be the better match. For this marriage to Casaubon is as good as going to a nunnery. Oh, on my account, if it is for Mrs. Brooke's sake, I think her friends should try to use their influence. Well, Humphrey doesn't know yet, but when I tell him, you may depend on it, he will say, why not? Casaubon is a good fellow, and young enough. These charitable people never know vinegar from wine until they have swallowed it and got the colic. However, if I were a man, I would prefer Celia, especially when Dorothea was gone. The truth is, you have been courting one and have won the other. I can see that she admires you almost as much as a man expects to be admired. And if it were anyone but me who said so, you might think it was exaggeration. Goodbye. Sir James handed Mrs. Cadwallader to the phaeton. 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 Carriage. And then jumped on his horse. He was not going to renounce his ride because of his friend's unpleasant news, only to ride the faster in some other direction than that of Tipton Grange. Now, why on earth should Mrs. Cadwallader have been at all busy about Mrs. Brooke's marriage? And why, when one match that she liked to think she had a hand in was frustrated, should she have straightway contrived the preliminaries of another? Well, if there was any ingenious plot, any hide-and-seek course of action, which might be detected by careful telescopic watch? Not at all. A telescope might have swept the parishes of Tipton and Freshett, and the whole area visited by Mrs. Cadwallader and her phaeton, without witnessing any interview that could excite suspicion, or any scene from which she did not return with the same unperturbed keenness of eye and the same high natural color. In fact, if that convenient vehicle had existed in the days of the Seven Sages, one of them would doubtless have remarked that you can know little of women by following them about in their pony phaetons. Okay, let's see. Let's see what that meant. Okay, so varium et mutable semper is Latin for women are always changeable and capricious. Okay, and the little note about the that I reason here is in the days of the Seven Sages. The Seven Sages were philosophers in ancient Greece. Well, it doesn't exactly say what a phaeton is. Well. Okay. Even with a microscope directed on the water drop, we find ourselves making interpretations which turn out to be rather coarse. For whereas under a weak lens you may seem to see a creature exhibiting an active voracity onto which other smaller creatures actively play as if they were so many animated tax pennies. Even with a microscope directed on a water drop, we find ourselves making interpretations which turn out to be rather coarse. For whereas under a weak lens you may seem to see a creature exhibiting an active voracity onto which other smaller creatures actively play as if they were so many animated tax pennies. A stronger lens reveals to you certain tiniest hairlets which make voracities for these victims, while the swallower waits passively at the receipt of his custom. Okay. Oh, Lord Shenanigans, you have no idea. This is, I think, my fourth time trying to read it. And the only reason I'm making it this far is because I'm recording myself. But yeah, no, this book has me so done. And funny enough, I don't think I don't know. I don't think I got too far. I know I didn't get too far at all. Either way. In this way, metaphorically speaking, a strong lens applied to Mrs. Cadwallader's matchmaking will show a play of minute causes producing what may be called thought and speech vortices to bring her the sort of food she needed. Okay. Her life was rurally simple, quite free from secrets either foul, dangerous, or otherwise bleh. Bleh. Her life was rurally simple, quite free from secrets either foul, dangerous, or otherwise important, and not consciously affected by the great affairs of the world. All the more did affairs of the great world interest her when communicating in the letters of the high-born relations, the way in which fascinating younger sons had gone to the dogs by marrying their mistresses, the fine old-blooded idiocy of the young Lord Tapir, and the furious, gouty humours of old Lord Megatherium, and the exact crossings of genealogies which had brought a coronet into a new The exact crossing of genealogies which had brought a coronet into a new branch and widened the relations of scandal. These were topics of which she retained details with the utmost accuracy, and reproduced them in an excellent pickle of epigrams, which she herself enjoyed the more because she believed as unquestionably in birth and no birth as she did in game and vermin. She would never have disowned anyone on the grounds of poverty. A De Bracy reduced to take his dinner in a basin would have seemed to her an example of pathos worth exaggerating, and I fear his atrocious vices would have not horrified her. But her feeling towards the vulgar rich was a sort of religious hatred. They had probably made all their money out of high retail prices, and Mrs. Cadwallader detested high prices for everything that was not paid in kind at the rectory. Such people were no part of God's design in making the world, and their accent was an affliction to the ear. A town where such monsters abounded was hardly more than a sort of low comedy, which could not be taken account of in a well-bred scheme of the universe. Let any lady who is inclined to be hard on Mrs. Cadwallader inquire into the comprehensiveness of her own beautiful views, and be quite sure that they afford accommodations for all the lives which have the honor to coexist with hers. With such a mind, active as phosphorus, biting everything that came near into the form that suited it, how could Mrs. Cadwallader feel that the Mrs. Brooks and their matrimonial prospects were alien to her, especially as if it had been the habit of years for her to scold Mr. Brooke with the friendliest frankness, and let him know in confidence that she thought him a poor creature. From the first arrival of the young ladies in Tipton, he had prearranged Dorothea's marriage with Sir James, and if it had taken place, would have been quite sure that it was her doing, and that it should not take place after she had preconceived it, caused her an irritation which every thinker will sympathize with. She was the diplomatist of Tipton and Freshitt, and for anything to happen in spite of her was an offensive irregularity. As to freaks like this of Mrs. Brooks, Mrs. Cadwallader had no patience for them, and now saw that her opinion of this girl had been infected with some of her husband's weak charitableness charitableness, those methodistical whims, and that air of being more religious than a rector and curate together, came from a deeper and more constitutional disease than she had been willing to believe. However, said Mrs. Cadwallader, first to herself and afterwards to her husband, I throw her over. There was a chance, if she had married Sir James, of her becoming a sane and sensible woman. He would never have contradicted her, and when a woman is not contradicted, she has no motive for obstinacy in her absurdities. But now I wish her joy of her hair shirt. I throw her over. There was a chance, if she had married Sir James, of her becoming a sane, sensible woman. He would never have contradicted her, and a woman is not contradicted. She has no motives for obstinacy in her absurdities. But now I wish her joy in her hair shirt. Okay, I have no idea what the hell that means. It followed that Mrs. Cadwallader must decide on another match for Sir James, and having made up her mind that it was to be the younger Miss Brooke, there could not have been a more skilful move towards the success of her plan than for her to hint to the baronet that he had made an impression on Celia's heart. For he was not one of those gentlemen who languished after the unattainable Sappho's apple that lasts from the topmost bough. For he was not one of those gentlemen who languish after the unattainable Sappho's apple that lasts from the topmost bough. The charms which smell like the knot of cowslips on the cliff, not to be come at by the willing hand. He had no sonnets to write, and it could not strike him agreeably that he was not an object of preference for the women he preferred. Already the knowledge that Dorothea had chosen Mr. Casaubon had bruised his attachment and relaxed its hold. Although Sir James was a sportsman, he had some other feelings towards women than towards grouse and foxes, and did not regard his future wife in the light of prey, valuably chiefly for the excitement of the chase. So basically he's not the type, although he was a sportsman, he had some other feeling towards women than he did of grouse and foxes, and did not regard his future wife in the light of prey, valuable chiefly for the excitement of the chase. Neither was he so well acquainted with the habits of primitive races as to feel that an ideal combat for him, tomahawk in hand, so to speak, was necessary to the historical continuity of the marriage tie. On the contrary, having the amiable vanity which knits us to those who are fond of us, and disinclines us to those who are indifferent, and also a good, grateful nature, the mere idea that a woman had a kindness towards him spun little threads of tenderness from out of his heart towards hers. Thus it happened that after Sir James had ridden rather fast for half an hour in the direction away from Tipton Grange, he slackened his pace and at last turned onto a road which would lead him back by a shorter cut. Various feelings wrought in him the determination, after all, to go to the Grange today, as if nothing new had happened. He could not help rejoicing that he had never made the offer and had been rejected. Mere friendly politeness required that he should call to see Dorothea about the cottages, and now happily Mrs. Cadwallader had prepared him to offer his congratulations, if necessary, without showing too much awkwardness. He really did not like it. Giving up Dorothea was very painful to him, but there was something in the resolve to make this visit forthwith and conquer all show of feelings, which was a sort of file-biting and counter-irritant, and without his distinctly recognizing the impulse, there certainly was present in him a sense that Celia would be there, and that he should pay her more attention than he had done before. We mortals, men and women, devour many a disappointment between breakfast and dinner time, keep back the tears, and look a little pale about the lips, and in answer to inquiry say, "Oh, nothing." Pride helps, and pride is not a bad thing when it only urges us to hide our hurts, not to hurt others. Okay, I knew that was a hard one going in. Like I said, this was like the fourth time I read this one. Thankfully, I think this one's a short. Yeah, this one's short-ish. Let me see. 8. How long is 8? 9. Okay, yeah, I'll read 7. Okay, 7. Passer y propon vol la sua stagione. Stagione. Alright. Thank you for putting Latin in there. No, not Latin. That was Italian. I would prefer the Latin. At least I can... When I destroy a dead language, it's a dead language. Nobody's yelling at me. The proverb translates to... Pleasure and melons want the same... Oh, pleasure and melons want the same weather. I mean, true, but how is that a proverb? Mr. Casaubon, as might be expected, spent a great deal of his time at the Grange in these weeks, and the hindrance which courtship occasions to the progress of his great work, the key to Mr. Casaubon, as might be expected, spent a great deal of his time at the Grange in these weeks, and the hindrance which courtship occasioned to the progress of his great works, the key to all mythologies, naturally made him look forward the more eagerly to the happy termination of courtships. But he had deliberately incurred the hindrance, and having made up his mind that it was now time for him to adorn his life with the graces of female companionship, to irradiate the gloom which fatigue was apt to hang over the intervals of studious labor with the play of female fancy, and to secure in this his culminating age the solace of female tenderness for his declining years. Hence he determined to abandon himself to the stream of feeling, and perhaps was surprised to find what an exceedingly shallow rill it was. As in draughty reasons, baptism by immersion can only be performed symbolically. So Mr. Casaubon found that sprinkling with the utmost approach to a plunge which his stream would afford him, and he concluded that the poets had much exaggerated the force of masculine passion. Nevertheless, be observed with pleasure that Mrs. Brooke showed an ardent, submissive affection which promised to fulfill his most agreeable provisions of marriage. It had once or twice crossed his mind that possibly there was some deficiency in Dorothea to account for the moderation of his abandonment, but he was unable to discern the deficiency, or to figure to himself a woman who could have pleased him better, so that there was clearly no reason to fall back upon but the exaggerations of human tradition. "Could I not be preparing myself now to be a little more useful?" said Dorothea to him one morning early in the time of courtship. "Could I not learn to read Latin or Greek aloud to you as Milton's daughter did to their father without understanding what they read?" "No, Dorothea, because as someone who just tried to read Italian without understanding a single word of it, it don't work." "I fear that would be wearisome to you," said Mr. Casaubon, smiling. "And indeed, if I remember rightly, the young woman you have mentioned regarded that exercise in unknown tongues as a ground for rebellion against the poet." "See? You dumb bitch." "But in the first place, they were very naughty girls, else they would have been proud to minister to such a father. In the second place, they might have studied privately and taught themselves to understand what they read, and then it would have been interesting. I hope you don't expect me to be naughty and stupid." "Because those girls were real girls and you are a dumb bitch." "I expect you to be all that an exquisite young lady can be in every possible relation of life. Certainly it might be a great advantage if you were able to copy the Greek character, and to that end it were well to begin with a little reading." Dorothea seized on this as a precious permission. She would not have asked Mr. Casaubon once to teach her the languages, dreading of all things to be tiresome instead of helpful. But it was not entirely out of devotion to her future husband that she wished to know Latin and Greek. Those providence of masculine knowledge seemed to her a standing ground from which all truth could be seen more truly. As it was, she constantly doubted her own conclusion, because she felt her own ignorance. And how could she be confident that one-roomed cottages were not for the glory of God, where men who knew the classics appeared to conciliate indifferences to the cottages with zeal for the glory? "The fuck girl are you on?" "Perhaps even Hebrew might be necessary, at least the alphabet and a few roots, in order to arrive at the core of things and judge soundly on the social duties of a Christian." And she had not reached that point of renunciation at which she would have been satisfied with having a wise husband. She wished, poor child, to be wise herself. Mrs. Brooke was certainly very naive with all her alleged cleverness. "No shit." Celia, whose mind had never been thought too powerful, saw the emptiness of other people's pretensions much more readily. To have in general a little feeling seems to be the only security against feeling too much on any one particular occasion. However, Mr. Casaubon consented to listen and teach for an hour together like a schoolmaster of little boys, or rather, like a lover to whom a mistress's elementary ignorance and difficulties have a touching fitness. Few scholars would have disliked teaching the alphabet under such circumstances, but Dorothea herself was a little shocked and discouraged at her own stupidity, and the answers she got to some timid questions about the value of the Greek accents gave her a painful suspicion that here indeed there might be secrets not capable of explanation to a woman's reason. Ya damn bitch! Women are just as smart as men. But then again, this is written in a time when Mr. Brooke had no doubt on that point, and expressed himself with his usual strength upon it. One day that he came... Hold on. Sentence being stupid again. Mr. Brooke had no doubt on that point, and had expressed himself with his usual strength upon it one day that he came into the library while the reading was going forward. Well, but now, Casaubon, such deep studies, classics and mathematics, that kind of things are too taxing for a woman. Too taxing, you know. Dorothea's learning to read the characters simply, said Mr. Casaubon, evading the question. She had the very considerate thought of saving my eyes. Ah, well, without understanding, you know, that may not be so bad. But there is a lightness about the feminine mind, a touch and go, music and the fine arts and that kind of thing. They should study those up to a certain point, women should. In a light way, you know. A woman should be able to sit down and play you or sing you a good old English tune, and that is what I like. No, I heard most things, been at the opera in Vienna, Gluck, Mozart, everything of that sort. But I am a conservative in music. It's not like ideas, you know. I stick to the good old tunes. Mr. Casaubon is not fond of the piano, and I am very glad he is not, said Dorothea, whose slight regard for the domestic music and feminine fine arts must be forgiven her concerning the small tinkling and smearing in which they chiefly consisted in that dark period. She smiled and looked up at her betrothed with grateful eyes. If he had always been asking her to play the last rose of summer, she would have required much resignation. He said there is only an old harpsichord at Lerwick, and it is covered with books. And there you are behind Celia, my dear. Oh, wait, no, sorry. And there you are behind Celia, my dear. Celia now plays very prettily, and is always ready to play. However, since Casaubon does not like it, you are all right. But it's a pity you should not have a little recreations of that sort. Casaubon, the bow always strong, that kind of thing, you know, will not do. I could never look on it in the light of a recreation to have my ears teased with measured noises, said Mr. Casaubon. A tune much iterated has the ridiculous effect of making the words in my mind perform a sort of minuet to keep time. An effect hardly tolerable, I imagine, after boyhood. As to the grander forms of music worthy to accompany solemn celebration, and even to serve as an educating influence according to the ancient conception, I say nothing, for with these we are not immediately concerned. No, music of that sort I should enjoy, said Dorothea. When we are coming home from Lausanne, my uncle took us to hear the great organ at Freiburg, and it made me sob. That kind of thing is not healthy, my dear, said Mr. Brooke. Casaubon, she will be in your hands now. You must teach my niece to take things more quietly, eh, Dorothea? He ended with a smile, not wishing to hurt his niece, but really thinking that it was perhaps better for her to be early married to so sober a fellow as Casaubon, since she would not hear of Chettam. It is wonderful, though, he said to himself as he shuffled out of the room. It is wonderful that she should have liked him. However, the match is good. I should have been traveling out of my brief to have hindered it. Let Mrs. Cadwallader say what she will. He is pretty certain to be a bishop, is Casaubon, and that very seasonable pamphlet of his on the Catholic question, a deanery at least. They owe him a deanery. Well, okay. They should at least make him a dean. Thank you. That's all you need to say. Oh, well then again. I have to remember when this was published and written. Words. And here I must vindicate the claim to philosophical reflectiveness by remarking that Mr. Brooke, on this occasion, little thought of the radical speech which, at a later period, he was led to make on the incomes of the bishops. What elegant historian would neglect a striking opportunity for pointing out that his heroes did not foresee the history of the world, or even their own actions? For example, that Henry of Navarre, when a Protestant baby, little thought of being a Catholic monarch, or that Alfred the Great, who he measured his laborious nights with a burning candle, had no idea of future gentlemen measuring their idle day with watches. Here is a mine of truth, which, however vigorously may be worked, is likely to outlast all coal. But of Mr. Brooke I must further remark, perhaps less warranted by precedent, namely that if he had foreknown his speech, it might not have made any great difference. To think with pleasure of his niece's husband having a large ecclesiastical income was one thing. To make a liberal speech was another thing. And it is a narrow mind which cannot look at a subject from various points of view. Well, okay, I will admit there are a few things that I had highlighted in my past readings that came from these chapters. The we mortals, men and women, devour many a disappointment, and it is the narrow mind which cannot look on a subject from various points of view that I highlighted for personal keep because I did like those phrases, but other than that, really the only enjoyment I got out of these chapters is Mrs. Cadwallader. Is it Cadwallader? God forbid. These names. Yep, Mrs. Cadwallader. Mrs. Cadwallader is fun. I will admit she is fun. But again, this dumb bitch. Alright, but that's it for today. See you next week, I suppose. I got a headache. This book is just... Yeah. Alright, so, yep. Thank you. Have a good week.